All right, so got it. All right. Hang on, sorry. So before I get started, I do want to throw out a huge thank you to Patrick Bowman and the rest of the CMIS team, Lisa Park and everyone, but Patrick in particular met with me weekly for quite a while, working on kind of data analysis, trying to figure out what the heck it was that happened in the pandemic, which I'm still going to leave you with questions and possibly more than answers. So again, if you need to sneak away, you're like, what? But anyway, Patrick has really been really spent a lot of time on this, and I want to make sure that he gets appropriate credit. So I want to, so I'm going to kind of blow through this beginning stuff, which you may have may or may not have seen in the previous one. But what I want you to do is sort of imagine, if you can, that the pandemic didn't actually happen. And this is sort of important for how we kind of looked at data, and I'll get to how that works. So I have a couple of images. So for example, in 2020, there was no pandemic. So some weddings were like this, but a lot of weddings look like this. And sports didn't look like this at all. It looked much more like this. And traffic never, ever, ever. This is from, out west, as you can imagine. This is impossible. It, of course, looked like this. And so with that mindset, you can imagine yourself at planning time, maybe in the spring of this past year of 2021, and everybody's sitting down to look at data and trying to sort of think about, okay, and typically fatalities, of course, are the main focus of planning and crash data analysis and everything. And so when you look at fatalities from 2020 and start the kind of planning, you start sort of looking at this, what we can see is, first of all, it's always good to remind yourself of the long view, which is that things have really improved drastically from back in the late 60s, early 70s, when fatalities peaked. Because, and one of the reasons that it's good to keep looking at that is because the last maybe 10 years or so, since about the end of the Great Recession, give or take, have been less, sort of less positive. So fatalities, and this is Michigan, fatalities have been going up just a little bit, but in the grand scheme of things are not, obviously not nearly as bad as they used to be. But when you take the 10-year view, which is pretty typical for kind of the way we look at these things, you see this upward trend, and you see that 2020 looks a whole lot like the basic trend. So yes, it's the highest one in the last 10 years, but it's part of what sort of looks like a pattern over time. And when you start breaking this down, you get kind of the same view. So alcohol, drugs, everything's kind of, it's trending up, but 2020 is, looks normal. And speeding has been flat and continues to be flat. Unbelted is kind of, it was low for a while, it's going up. Pedestrians, bicyclists, same thing. So all of these graphs, when you look at 2020 in the context of previous years, and we did this statistically as well, it's not super remarkable. It's part of a trend that we don't like, but it looks all very, very similar. But then all of a sudden, so if you remember, then if you look at VMT, vehicle miles traveled, all of a sudden you sort of, come to your senses, and you're like, oh, wait a second, what we've been looking at looks normal and expected. Sorry, back to here. But in fact, there was a pandemic. There were roads that look like this. Vehicle miles have gone way down. And what that means then is that crash rate has gone way up. And so when you step away from fatalities we've been looking at and look at police reported crashes in general, you can see that they're down actually even more than vehicle miles traveled. So there's something really wonky going on that results in this huge increase in the fatal crash rate, where we're really tinkering with the denominator of that rate. So fatalities are kind of, I'm going to call it air quotes normal, so a little on the high side, but that denominator got really small. And interestingly, the overall police reported crash rate is actually down even a little bit. So the total number of crashes reduced by even more than the VMT did. Fatalities increased, well, I mean, they look sort of normal in spite of the 15% reduction in VMT. And so we've got this very weird very strange pattern that is kind of that we're trying to explain. So I offer up, I have 3 theories. I had 2 before, and I've got one that's a slight tweak on the other ones, but to sort of see, it's a little hard to tell. Again, these are just kind of thought theories, things to consider about what may or may not have happened. So my first theory is called the only the good miles disappeared theory. And as a setup, I have these diagrams and just want to sort of explain this a little bit. So the way I've diagrammed is we have miles. People drive around. Those are the miles. And some of those, the vast majority of those miles are really quite safe, quite benign. A whole lot of them are commuting to and from work. They're on, limited access highways. They're at slow speeds. They're generally, they're in the daytime, people are awake and so on. They're generally miles that actually have pretty low crash risk, not 0, but pretty low. And then there are a small number of miles, and in this, in reality, the actual number of miles that are truly dangerous are really, really, really small, but I can't diagram it. So this is just this is impressionistic. But these red miles are things like speeding miles and drunk miles and unbelted miles and so on. And so what happens then is that the dangerous miles result in more crashes. So they result in red is meant to sort of represent fatalities. Yellow is more serious injuries, and green is kind of property damage only and low level injuries, that kind of thing. So you have this huge number of benign miles that occasionally result in crashes, mostly property damage only, a small number of really dangerous miles that often result in fatalities and serious injuries. And then these processes, again, generically, result in crashes that we typically see. So this is the typical picture. And then when you do the math, you come up with a crash rate. But enter the pandemic. So the pandemic shows up, and essentially under this theory, what the pandemic does is it causes people to stay home, and largely it removes the good miles from the whole traveling sort of milieu or population, or however you want to think about it. So in essence, what happens is that people stop commuting. So they stop engaging in pretty low fatality risk kinds of driving. We chop out 15% of miles. And then, and what happens then is that we have sort of fewer miles to pipe into this kind of pretty benign pathway, but we still have all the same bad miles, still have all the same sort of fatality miles. Was there a question? Sorry, I heard no, okay. So the upshot of that then is that the fatality, the sort of fatality situation is kind of the same as normal, but because we're cutting out a bunch of miles out of the denominator, the fatality rate goes up, even though the fatality count is about the same. So an alternative view of this is what I call the people who drove like lunatics theory, which is more along the lines of, again, this is sort of broad brushstrokes, but essentially you've got the same sort of starting picture. This is normal, a normal year. And then what we do is we remove some miles, 15% of them, and at random. This results in removal of crashes, also at random. But then what happens is that the miles that remain get more dangerous. So this occurs potentially because people who are going, so there's a couple of possibilities. One is that people who are going to speed or drive drunk are going to do it anyway. So that is, the pandemic isn't stopping them. And but in another possibility is that the opportunity to speed is out there. There's big wide open roads, and so you can drive faster, but proportionally, either way, proportionally, we end up with a larger sort of subset of dangerous miles, which then leads to, so even though there's fewer total miles, we end up having, again, this sort of larger pathway, and then the smaller pathway on the green side. And the upshot of that is that you end up with an increase in fatality count, theoretically. I mean, it could actually even out, and an increase in the fatality rate. A slightly different version of this is less about, so what's the distinction? So again, same starting point, same 15% reduction, and same sort of increase in the sort of speed of miles. But here the concept, which to be honest, I can't distinguish in the data from the other one, but the concept is that that in fact, traffic actually slows people down. So, and specifically the sort of crash speed, impact speed, or the difference in speed between sort of two things that are hitting each other is by far the best predictor of injury outcome. So a crash that occurs at higher speed, we call it delta V, but it doesn't matter. Crash that occurs at higher speed is going to produce a greater risk of injury for the occupants of a vehicle, and it's true even for pedestrians, who of course are at very high risk of injury. And so to some degree, if there are simply obstacles out in the world when you're driving around, when there's, the sort of normal amount of traffic, even people who are trying to get somewhere fast or trying to speed can only go so fast. And drunkenness is kind of an interesting piece of this, but ultimately, if you sort of shift the whole distribution of speed of crash up, what you're going to get is an increase in sort of these kind of higher speed crashes. So I want to point out, so this is like mentally, from a data perspective, is virtually indistinguishable from the previous theory, but I think at least mentally, the idea here is that in the sort of lunatic theory, you have people who sort of see an opportunity in open roads, or are for other reasons, driving drunk more. Maybe, we know that the pandemic caused more alcohol consumption and things like that, so that there's actually extra people doing extra of the problematic, dangerous, bad behaviors. Alternatively, there's this idea here is that there wasn't really exactly extra of it. It sort of stayed the same, but that the outcomes of everything that people were continuing to do were just worse because they weren't slowed down. And again, this is just sort of food for thought. So I want to take a look at what actually happened to try to sort of pull these things apart. So one of the first things we like to do in looking at crash data is to actually look at crash type. Crash type is helpful because essentially crash types more or less reflect certain kinds of mechanisms of crashes. And so for example, this yellow line, I hope you can see the colors, apologies, is rear end crashes. And what you see, and this is again, all crashes, not just fatalities, but what you see is that rear end crashes were way, way, way down. Rear end crashes are, as a sort of individual crash type, are the most common, or certainly the most common multi-vehicle crash type. And they're down, so remember, VMT is down 15%, crashes are down 22%. A huge chunk of that reduction in crashes is due to rear end crashes. And rear end crashes are really a lot about congestion. They happen a lot in the commuting pattern, the sort of morning, afternoon commute thing. They're not so common at night and on weekends. Is kind of the opposite of drunk driving crashes. And so, and because they're so numerous, having them go down by a lot is pushing down on kind of the crash types. Single vehicle crashes, however, are down 8%. So 15% reduction in mileage, only an 8% reduction in single vehicle crashes. Single vehicle crashes, the mechanisms for those are broadly drunkenness, speeding, too fast for conditions, too fast for curves, that kind of thing. And so again, what you see looking at crash type is you got these three, which is side swipe, angle, and head on, which are all approximately in line with the reduction in VMT and crashes. Huge reduction in rear end crashes, and much smaller reduction in single vehicle crashes, which reflect these kind of risky behaviors. So that's a hint of things to come. When we look at fatal crashes at the whole aggregated year level, we see no significant differences in any of those. There's a little bit of increase on the single vehicle side, but really everything is really pretty flat. And so mechanism wise, again, aggregated over the year, fatals look typical, air quotes. So after we sort of puzzled over this for quite a while, we decided to look in more detail at what happened over time, because COVID obviously was not, it wasn't a static thing over the course of 2020. So what happened in 2020 with respect to COVID, and these lines, I know I used the same color, which was dumb, but these are COVID cases. Sorry, orange is COVID deaths and blue is COVID cases. And what's important here is that basically what happened was January, February, and the very beginning of March were normal. We're just like any other year, any other time. And then COVID arrived in spades in the US. And basically on March 24th, the statewide stay-at-home order began. And you see this, there's a big peak in deaths. And then that stay-at-home order went until June 12th. So it was a little bit of, well, I'll show you what happens with vehicle miles and stuff. But basically there's this big period of about almost 2 months where people really were not supposed to be coming and going aside from essential workers and so on. And then in the summertime, COVID cases were actually pretty low. Things were slowly starting to open up, but mostly it was, the outdoors was wide open for people. And then in the fall, when people started going indoors, just like happened again this year, we started to see an increase in COVID cases. And then we actually returned to partial shutdown for a little while in December. So these two sort of pale yellow regions are areas where statewide there was some form of shutdown that was kind of motivating people to not do what they normally do, not go out the way they normally do. So when you look at VMT and crashes, so this graph I want to sort of orient you to. The way that I've set this up is I'm graphing change from 2019. So previously this was COVID cases and deaths, just counting them up like a lot of things, but this is sort of looking at change, I think, as a way to kind of, particularly emphasize kind of what was going on. So this dotted line across the middle is essentially everything was the same as 2019. So if we saw a flat line across the middle, which is what we would expect to see year to year, more or less, then that means that things were just kind of typical normal. January, February in both, so VMT is blue, crashes is orange. We see kind of standard VMT slightly increased. And then obviously in March, when the stay-at-home order, and April in particular, all of a sudden both of these plummet. They go down by more than 50%, both of them, both crashes and VMT. And then they start to kind of tick up slowly and kind of settle in at about 12% reduction. So again, both VMT and crashes. And of course, the thing you notice here is that crashes and VMT crashes are tracking VMT almost entirely through the year. So crashes really are just a kind, when you're counting crashes in the aggregate, they really are sort of so heavily influenced by just how much people are out there driving. In contrast, fatalities have these very special mechanisms. And so they're smaller numbers. And so what we see then is there was a reduction in fatalities, and quite substantial. So they went down by like 25% or so when everybody went to stay at home, still well above the reduction in VMT. But then as soon as people started coming out, the fatalities were actually above 2019 levels, even though VMT and crashes as a whole were remaining below. So this was kind of gap, and actually the gap is all through here, is really the interesting, and obviously when I say interesting, I don't mean that necessarily in a good way, but really the remarkable aspect of the pandemic is, why the heck fatalities sort of remain where they are and mechanisms are still in play, even though so much less driving and so much less. So think back to those kind of theories about why we get this big gap between the two. So so the next thing to sort of take a look at is really all about risky choices. So we're talking about fatalities, we're talking about risky behavior, because that's really what produces it in large part. And for these graphs, which I'm doing monthly, I have the yellow bits are, again, the sort of statewide level shutdowns or partial shutdowns, just kind of for reference. So when we look at, and the other thing I'm doing is that the blue line is the sort of average over the previous 9 years. So from 2011 to 2019, kind of average. So one thing is that average, just because of data, is going to be pretty stable, whereas we'll get, more wibbliness of a single year. That'll happen. But this is crashes as a whole. So drinking crashes, alcohol involved crashes, see a big reduction in during the shutdown, and then essentially return to normal levels, and then a reduction again in December when people really weren't visiting family or doing New Year's things, and again there was this sort of partial shutdown. So this is interesting. So all through the summer, even though vehicle miles traveled are down, we have kind of the normal looking amount of drunk driving crashes. So people who were driving drunk, aside from here, were doing it in spite of sort of pandemic. So this is kind of consistent with the whole good miles removed. So maybe they're not driving to work, but they're, and through a lot of this period, they can't be going to the bars because the bars couldn't be open, but there's still drunk driving going on. When we look at fatal crashes involving alcohol, it's the same general pattern, except that again, we've got this huge gap, this huge sort of increase in the sort of fatality outcomes. So here's drunk driving crashes, here's the outcomes. So on a kind of per drunk driving crash basis, we're actually getting more fatalities per crash in 2020. So more severe, more, you know, it's a little hard to kind of sort out exactly what, if you're driving drunk and don't end up in a, you know, in a fatal crash, which happens, you know, what is it that sort of leads that to happen? What leads you to actually get home, you know, without an event or without a fatality? This gap is really interesting. So again, these crashes were occurring at about the same rate, but they were just more deadly, 14%. Drug involved crashes, it's kind of, so they were just up, although this is tricky because when we're looking at you know, the previous 9 years of average, we're averaging across years when testing and reporting of drugs and crashes was actually very different. So this increase may just reflect the fact that we've been testing at a much, you know, at an increasing level. When you look at this gap, though, it's a little bit higher. So drugs is a little hard to kind of sort out what exactly is going on, and the numbers are relatively small compared to alcohol, but there it is. So let's take a look at speeding. So speeding has this same quality. So here's the average over the last years. We get this big reduction in March, April, where everybody just stays home, some additional reduction November, December, but at the crash level, we've got essentially the same number of speeding related crashes broadly. And then when you look at fatalities, particularly in this weird sort of peakiness, but and again, small numbers, but essentially the speeding crashes that did occur were more likely to produce a fatality than they had been in previous years, than the average of previous years. Unbelted occupants, same thing. It's, you know, this is all looking the same. So here's this gap. More of the unbelted occupants end up in fatal crashes. So one question that comes to mind, well, kind of in the world of risky choices, one question that invariably comes to mind is, was it an age thing? So was this a situation where younger drivers were going out and doing this? And so again, proportionally, we end up with kind of an increase in the kinds of risky behaviors. Were they responsible at some level? And I'm just going to go through all crashes pretty quickly, and you can watch the graph. So what the graphs are, again, it's the same deal. We've got this average over the last 9 years, and then we look at 2020. So here's 16 to 20, here's 21 to 24, here's 25 to 64, here's 64 plus. Literally, when I was building these graphs, I actually had to go back and make sure that I was actually that I was picking up the right data, that I wasn't just like picking up the same old data. And you can see they change a little bit, but the pattern is virtually identical. So whatever was going on with the pandemic affected everybody pretty much equally. You get this drop and so on. When you look at fatal crashes, these are very small numbers, but take a look at, so 21 to 25 has this big peak in the summertime. 26 to 64 kind of extends longer, but still has the peak. 65 plus, even 65 plus drivers show, and again, small numbers, but they show a pattern that essentially is in the summertime when people went back out driving and they weren't driving at normal levels, each individual crash was simply more on average, more deadly. But it doesn't appear to me that this is, somehow particularly attributable to, younger drivers, for example, that we might normally be attributing it to. It looks like it was equal opportunity across the board. So what do we make of this? This graph is, which is a little bit complicated, and I'll sort of explain it, but for me is kind of the single summary graph of what happened in 2020 in Michigan. So what's going on here is this black line is so this is again going back to a graph that shows change relative to 2019. So we're going to use 2019 as the model of, normal. It's pretty typical. I could have used an average or something, and 0 means nothing changes. So if nothing changes in 2020, you just see a bunch of flat lines across the middle. And that's what we would normally see in a year over year kind of way, with some wibbliness in the smaller sample size, like fatals and stuff. But of course, what we see in VMT is this big drop. Again, it dropped like as much as 40% over 2019. And then it comes back up and it kind of settles in. So that, sorry, I should have put a line here, but this is the 0 line. So VMT settles in a relative way around 10-ish% reduced from 2019. That's where it just sits for the rest of the year after this big drop. The rest of these lines are separating out injury level. So if you look at the no injury, the blue line, and you look at the yellow line, possible injury, these are really pretty, and nobody wants to crash, but these are really mild outcomes. And this is at the crash level. So this is the worst thing that happened in the crash was property damage or minor injuries. And what happened with those is they went down consistently. They were down more than VMT. So this is this kind of idea that it really does kind of support this, like the good miles drop out, or that miles. So the kinds of traffic events or the kinds of processes that produce mild crashes with sort of low injury were reduced by way more than VMT sort of suggests. As you go through, so gray is B injuries, green is A injuries here, but they're in order. This is fatalities. So essentially what happened then was that the more severe the crash, the more severe the outcome, the less it changed, and in fact even increased from relative to 2019. So this goes back to this idea that each crash that did occur was actually on average more severe, certainly more severe relatively speaking, but even sort of increased in severity relative to a more typical year. So looking at that graph and sort of thinking about what's going on, there is this big difference in the relative reduction of crashes as a function of severity. So severe crashes were not reduced, and in some cases even increased. And so in a way so this really sort of supports the idea that people were out there, the people who were out there were crashing at higher speeds or driving at higher speeds. So the idea that people might have taken an opportunity, this is sort of the lunatic theory, or even that there simply wasn't anything there to slow people down or to stop them from, sort of moving too fast. But when we look at the whole rear end crashes versus other crash types, that's really a strong indicator also that ordinary driving, low risk driving, was really preferentially reduced. So this is sort of similar to this, what I call the good miles gone theory, where yeah, okay, it was a 15% reduction in VMT and a big reduction in crashes, but really the VMT that was not being driven was VMT that were not, that really just doesn't produce bad outcomes very much. So in a somewhat unhelpful way for presenting theories, it kind of seems like both of these things are, it seems pretty clear that the miles that people didn't drive really were largely, presumably, commuting miles, and really were largely miles that don't tend to result in really bad outcomes. But the sort of idea of crashes were occurring at higher speeds, or people were even kind of taking, people either weren't slowed down by the natural processes, or they were actively kind of seeking out open roads. If they were going to drive drunk, the pandemic wasn't going to stop them. If they were going to go to work, the pandemic stopped them. But if they were going to drive drunk, so these kinds of behaviors were all kind of there in the background, but they blow up in relationship to the VMT in this context. So it's useful to think about how this compares to the Great Recession. So the Great Recession, VMT actually went down by about, and this is a much longer time frame, but VMT fell about 2% total over an extended period with, some more. But fatalities dropped 25% over this like 5-year period. So we had this huge drop in fatalities with a reduction that wasn't explained by a reduction in travel. And interestingly, in the Great Recession, young drivers really were preferentially accounting for a large share of that drop in fatalities. So where you had, in previous years, like compared to pre-Great Recession, you had young drivers responsible for X amount of particularly fatalities. Suddenly they dropped, their contribution to fatalities dropped by much more than other age groups and much more than the VMT drop. So I was involved with, so Dan Blower, who's retired now, led a study that was actually published in 2020, but we conducted it several years prior to that to sort of study what was going on in the Great Recession. And essentially our sort of interpretation of what happened then was that either risky drivers, so people are going to tend to drive drunk or tend to speed, or sort of maybe what I'm going to call kind of optional driving, where so maybe people drive to work, but they don't. But if they're sort of hurt financial by the recession, maybe they don't do kind of recreational driving or recreational drinking and driving, that kind of thing. So either way, these sorts of processes are more affected by the recession than other processes. So other people, other groups. So if you think about it from an age group perspective, young people are kind of most vulnerable to losing jobs in the recession or losing income. And as a result, they sort of took themselves out of the VMT population because they're more responsible for things like drunk driving and speeding. Then you get this kind of recession effect where the recession is actually removing, air quotes, bad VMT more than proportionally. In contrast, of course, the pandemic is removing good driving more than proportionally. So the pandemic, of course, was a really different situation. So first of all, aside from, important groups of people who are on this call, sort of first responders, but aside from really a fairly small proportion of the population, it really affected everybody kind of blanket. So I'm still working from home here, and all kinds of people, just suddenly stopped commuting to work. And so there's this like very sudden effect. You can see it in the lockdown data that, suddenly everything. So it ends up being, again, certain kinds of that it wasn't sort of economic contraction over time that was preferential to certain groups. It kind of basically affected everybody. It was very sudden, it was extreme, and then it kind of ended. And so when we look at that age distribution, we're not seeing big differences across age. So it seems to be this sort of process that's kind of equal opportunity. But it also appears to be the case, again, that, if you're going out, in some ways going out in a pandemic, aside from, again, people with reason to some degree, going out in a pandemic, driving around, traveling is a somewhat risky behavior. And so arguably people who are inclined to engage in risky behaviors might also be inclined, to go out in general. That is, the pandemic is not stopping people from driving drunk if they're going to drive drunk. That's a particular interpretation sort of theory. So one of the things, I guess one major thing that I want to leave you with is, which will surprise no one in this room, you'll be like, why did I spend this hour? The behavior on the road is huge, right? So we're a lot of safety improvements come from vehicle automation and improvements in vehicle crashworthiness, improvements in infrastructure that sort of keep people safe. A lot of it is keep people from having bad outcomes given that they're in a crash. So that's sort of interesting. But even weather can't sort of produce anything quite this extreme. Nothing can be on a scale other than human behavior, driver behavior. And so we're kind of back to the, or left with the sort of standard idea, which is that, fatalities are really driven by risky behaviors, and stopping them is kind of the thing that needs, and even a pandemic that literally stopped everybody from going to work didn't prevent those kinds of events from happening. And so this was sort of the result, is this very weird, very surprising, remarkable, increase in fatalities, or sort of standard fatalities on the year compared to everything else sort of dropping. So questions? I think we've got about 10 minutes. So. Oh yeah, the motorcycles. We looked at motorcycles, and I'm going to not. I'll take a look and get back to you on that, because if I say it off the top of my head, I'll be wrong. But I believe we did see increase in fatalities. I don't think we saw that level of increase, but I'll check. Thanks. Sorry about that. I meant to include that. Other questions?
I'm not. Oh, here's one from Mike Prince. What
Yeah,
about the legalization of marijuana and the potential for this to have played a role?
right. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So it's quite clear from the data that marijuana is, one of the challenges, as I sort of mentioned, is that both marijuana use via legalization and testing for marijuana are on the increase kind of together. And so sometimes it's a little hard to tell in the crash data which one we're looking at. It's definitely the case that there is more positive testing for marijuana, more positive tests for marijuana occurring in the context of crashes. And the big thing with marijuana appears to be like what they call polydrug. So marijuana and alcohol go together. Thanks, Jackie. The marijuana and alcohol go together. Alcohol is a bigger risk factor from crash perspective than marijuana, which is not to say that that marijuana isn't a problem, but I think that that's feeding into the same set of processes. So it's a thing that's been happening over time, but then it's the same deal. If you're going to drive under the if you're going to drive under the influence, it appears that the pandemic wouldn't stop someone. So yeah, that's my best guess. Yeah, Betty's question. It is 2021 data will be really interesting, because when we get the 2021 data, even looking at the end of 2020, see if I can kind of go back. Oh, there's my dog. Well, here's one. So when we look at the end of 2020, there was a reduction, there was shutdown in December, there was sort of reduction in driving. But when you look at kind of where things, we had this big shutdown, but things really kind of landed in a bit of a stable state with respect to travel, and to some degree, these things interestingly are coming down. So I don't know. What will be interesting is sort of, does the pandemic just really kind of lead us back to a new normal with respect to driving that's maybe below? What I'm hoping is that it also leads us back to the sort of previous normal. I mean, it'd be nice to see everything go down. And maybe there's a hint of it in the end of year data from 2020, but 2021 will be really an interesting thing to sort out, whether we are riding a roller coaster, or whether people are just kind of, they've just decided what kind of travel they're going to do in the context of this in the background. Data regarding children in crashes. I have to say, we didn't look, I will add that to the list for Patrick and me, because we're working on a report that's sort of more detailed. So I didn't look as closely at the age of people who were hurt. It was more about sort of drivers and people who are kind of engaging in behaviors that lead to these particular outcomes. But the question about children is really interesting, because you can imagine, I mean, there was a big chunk of time where lots of places just didn't have schools. So places children would go weren't available, and they may actually just have been kind of out of vehicles more. That's a really interesting question, and I'll look into that. Lisa, I think we posted the previous, there we go. Yes. And actually, if you're looking at recordings, I think I did a better job the first time. So you can look at these are really good questions that are different from the November one, but either way. And I think the slides are up also. Other questions? Slides are
It's a quiet group this morning, Dr. Flannagan.
Pardon?
It's a quiet group this morning.
Yeah, well, you know, it's hard to get up and start. Oh, thank you, Betty. That was very nice. Yeah, no, this is actually great. It's been, you know, we're sort of puzzling through. I think, like, in terms of, and hang on, Angie, because that's a really good question. You know, in terms of sort of messages, the irony is that, to me, the basic message is that the stuff that people are doing to try to keep behaviors off the road is just doesn't go away, unfortunately. And you know, so it's like we didn't learn any special tricks in the pandemic for making things better. Perhaps we just learned in spades that behavior is problematic. But let me hit Angie's question and then Mike's. Yeah, more people working remote. That's kind of what I was thinking, is that if we see this sort of line, this general VMT line settling in at about 10% down, and who knows, 2021 may be, you know, up a tick, but settling in with kind of the commuting miles reduced, may indeed result in that kind of new normal. So hypothetically, if the congestion improves safety ideas there, then even in sort of, you know, commuting traffic, crashes may occur at higher speed if there is less congestion. That's actually possible, even without any other kind of behavioral factors. So it's possible that we actually see a tick up in the bad outcomes just simply resulting from people being able to drive faster, and that's, you know, there's just kind of a general thing. But it is a really interesting question about, you know, what miles do people continue to drive, and which miles don't they, and are we seeing a real genuine shift away from work-related miles that then just sort of leaves everything else behind? It's a good question. Yeah, Mike, yes, there has been a reduction in traffic enforcement, and you guys were kind enough to send us data that we actually that I talked about when I did a talk on just the speeding component. And it's a really interesting question. So that actually I should have talked about, which is that part of what may be going on in this May, June, July, and this is particularly consistent with the whole like driving like a lunatic theory, is that if people who wanted to speed, or for whatever reason were, you know, that people may have been emboldened by the you know, reductions in enforcement. It's entirely possible, and it'd be interesting to sort out whether. So one thing we see obviously a big reduction in tickets, but that didn't that you would expect from reductions in enforcement. One of the sort of elements of this that I think about is when I go back to speeding vehicles in all crashes. So when you look at how much people are speeding generally, it matches previous years. So and of course people are driving less, so that's sort of interesting. This is probably a pretty good indicator of the general rate of speeding that's out there, but then of course in fatal crashes the outcomes are much worse. And so it's entirely plausible that when, I don't know if enforcement is back to normal, but yeah, okay. And OWI enforcement is down over 30% in 10 years. So it'll be interesting to match up the kind of change in enforcement as it returns to whatever the new normal is against the amount of speeding in crashes, and then again against fatalities, to sort out how much that's putting some downward pressure on it. But that's a great question that I don't want to forget to include in the larger report. Thank you. Anything else? I think we're about at time anyway, so I really appreciate the engagement. It's so helpful to have more thoughts about this, and we'll try to incorporate this into kind of the write-up and stuff. And if anything else comes to mind, feel free to reach out.